Well, our text today was actually introduced in November when I was on vacation. We've taken a bit of a parenthesis in our series. We've worked our way through the whole book of Genesis, doing a quick flyover and seeing Jesus and even Christmas in Genesis. And now we return to our Matthew series. But this text was introduced in the first two verses of Matthew 27 with these words. When morning came, all the chief priests and the elders of the people took counsel against Jesus to put him to death. And they bound him and led him away and delivered him over to Pilate the governor. Now the goal was crystal clear. Those who had arrested Jesus, those who had now dragged him in to be tried, had one intent from the get-go, and that was that he would be put to death. But then Matthew inserts a break in the action of the trial, and he recounts Judas' suicide. And now our text today resumes this account of Jesus' trial before Pilate. I would say that our text is a bit of a courtroom drama, and we find in it the typical cast of characters. We see that there's a judge, that there's a prosecution, and there's a defense. But this is not just any trial. The judge is infamous. The infamous Pontius Pilate, the man who ultimately condemned to death the very Son of God. The prosecutors are the chief priests and the elders, members of the Jewish ruling council. They are led by a deposed high priest, Annas, and his son-in-law, the current high priest, a man even more wicked than his father-in-law named Caiaphas. And in all of the Christian world, they too are regarded as infamous. And then there is the defendant. He defends himself. He stands alone, Jesus. Now, before we take a close look at our text, there's a confusing element that we need to address, because none of the gospel authors present a chronologically complete record of Jesus' trial. They all tell part of the story, none of them lay it all out. But with some careful work, I think we can uncover that there were actually 6 distinct trials, and that they all take place in very rapid succession over a remarkably short period of time, not exceeding 12 hours, probably less than that. Now, the first 3 trials occur during the middle of the night, following Jesus' arrest in the Garden of Gethsemane. And the first trial is before the deposed Jewish high priest, Annas. And the reason why he keeps figuring into the story is that although Rome deposed him, the Jewish people still regarded him as the true high priest. So we will often see that Annas is still having significant roles of leadership in the Jewish community. Now, this first trial is described in John 18, verses 12 through 14 and 19 through 23. If it were not for John's gospel, we would not know of this particular proceeding. I would say in many regards this is a preliminary proceeding, and there was no verdict rendered. Now, the second trial was before the Jewish high priest Caiaphas, the son-in-law of Annas, the one who is now the legal high priest. And these proceedings, also preliminary, were described only in John chapter 18, verse 24. Were it not for that one verse in John, we would not know that this had taken place. And once again, as a preliminary hearing, no verdict is rendered. Now, the third trial is much more attested to. This is Jesus before the Jewish ruling council, or the Sanhedrin. And it is described in Luke chapter 22 and Matthew chapter 26, that we studied a couple of months ago, in Mark 14 going on to the beginning of Mark 15. Now, this third trial is very important, and the most important distinguishing characteristic is that it was an illegal trial. And the reason that we can say that is because there are extra-biblical sources, pre-rabbinical sources, that actually tell us what was legal in a Jewish trial and what was forbidden. And there are no less than 12 illegalities in this third trial. Now, good news, I'm not going to go through all 12 of them today. I just want to go and highlight very quickly the most important ones. Number one, the trial was held at night. Now, one time I got a traffic ticket for a railroad crossing infraction, and I decided that I should be able to beat this ticket. And I went to night court, and the judge was so angry at me for wasting his time that he doubled my fine. I had to bolt out of court, run to an ATM, get back 3 seconds before they closed the door, or I would have been in contempt of court. Well, night court is a thing, but not in the Jewish legal system. All proceedings had to be done under the light of day. Also, we find that some members were excluded, purposely excluded. 2 prominent members of the Jewish ruling council were men who were sympathetic to Jesus. Nicodemus, who sought him out at night, and then also Joseph of Arimathea, in whose grave or tomb Jesus was buried. But they did not know anything of the proceedings. They had been left out. That was a violation. Also, as we look at the trial, we find that no witnesses were permitted to speak on Jesus' behalf. There were false witnesses, and they grew quite eloquent, but nobody stood up for Jesus. He stood alone. That too was illegal. We wouldn't allow that in our legal system, right? Our legal system is largely based on not only Jewish law, but Roman law as well. And in our system, there must be a defense. But then perhaps the greatest and most consequential illegality. It was illegal to ever render a verdict the same day that a person was arrested. How can you mount a credible defense if you have no time to prepare? And when life was on the line, as it was here, this was a gross violation of their own Jewish laws. Now, in this third trial, a verdict is pronounced. Jesus is accused of blasphemy, and he's sentenced to death. And then he is beaten and mocked by the temple guards. And you know, I so often consult with scholarly commentaries and then find my greatest insights in some website. And I found this website called alampuntomyfeet.org. Great memorable name. And they described this game that was played. And I found it fascinating, but also heartbreaking. While Jesus was in the hands of the temple soldiers, they beat him. The cruel amusement of the soldiers was a game called Hot Hand. They blindfolded Jesus. And while he was blindfolded, each soldier would strike him in the face with all of their might, except for one soldier. Then the blindfold was removed, and they asked Jesus to identify which soldier hit him. And since he was reputed to be a prophet, this should be no problem. So they repeated the cycle again and again and again. And Jesus refused to play their game. Our text today is the fourth trial, the first trial before Pilate, and this one takes place during the light of day. The Jewish trial before the Sanhedrin, which was really more like a kangaroo court, had deemed Jesus guilty of blasphemy, of speaking against the God of Israel, speaking that which was heresy in their mind. However, Rome didn't care about this charge, and the Jews, lacking the authority to sentence Jesus to death, had to gain the permission of the Roman governor. Which brings me to my first point of emphasis today, and that's the judge, Pontius Pilate. We read about him in chapter 27, verse 11. Now Jesus stood before the governor, and the governor asked him, "Are you the king of the Jews?" And Jesus said, "You have said so." Commentator James Montgomery Boyce, one of my favorites, provides a fascinating background on the man Pontius Pilate. And he says, and I quote, "The greatest puzzle of the Roman trial is the contrast between what we know of Pilate's character from secular sources and his conduct at the trial of Jesus as reported in the Gospels. Pilate was not a noble person. He'd come from Spain, served under Germanicus in the wars on the Rhine that would have been throughout Germany and France and other parts of Europe. He had risen to his relatively minor post as the governor of Judea through his marriage to Claudia Procula, a granddaughter of the Emperor Augustus. Now, the marriage was a smart career move. He married up, but it was a moral disgrace. See, Claudia's mother, Julia, was notorious for her coarse immorality, even in decadent Rome, and her daughter was just like her. Years ago, I watched a series that came out in the mid-1970s called I, Claudius. Maybe some of you saw it, and it was all about the immorality that existed within the household of Augustus. He wanted to bring back family values, Roman patrician family values, and his own family was a septic tank. In fact, Augustus referred to both his wife and his daughter Claudia with these words, were I wifeless or had childless died. Another important fact about Pontius Pilate is that he was an anti-Semite, that he had a genuine hatred of the Jewish people. Most of his predecessors chose to keep the peace. In fact, Pilate is the seventh of these Jewish governors, of these Roman governors over Judea. And all of the others went out of their way to learn what ticked the Jews off. What were their sensibilities? What was their religion? What would they deem to be a violation? They all did everything they could to maintain the peace, except for Pontius Pilate. You see, the very first thing that Pilate did as the governor was to install Roman shields with Roman eagles engraved on them on the very walls of the temple. Now, of course, we know that this is the Jews' most holy site. Now, these were regarded as pagan symbols. They were also regarded as graven images, which was an outright violation of the second commandment. As a result, a riot ensued, and Pilate actually wound up on the hot seat because of his failure to maintain the peace. Tiberius, the emperor, very nearly recalled him, and if he was recalled, he could well have lost his life. Now, most people would kind of wise up. They would look and say, okay, I overplayed my hand. Maybe I need to learn a little bit more. Maybe I need to act a little bit differently. But not Pilate. His second offense was a public works project, the building of an aqueduct to supply Jerusalem with additional water. Now, where's the harm in that? I mean, a city like Jerusalem needs good drinking water, right? And if you study in the Old Testament, you'll find that a reliable supply of drinking water was often a problem in Jerusalem. So what was the problem? Well, Pilate wanted to impress the very emperor that he had offended by his failure to maintain the peace. And what better way to please the emperor than to save the emperor some money? So he raided the temple treasury, used one of their most highly regarded special funds, the Corban Fund, to finance the project. Once again, there was a protest, and Pilate responded by beating and killing some of the protesters. Now, the third offense was recorded in Luke chapter 13, verse 1. There were some present at that very time who told him about the Galileans whose blood Pilate had mingled with their sacrifices. In other words, he killed them when they came to offer their sacrifices. Now, Jesus in this verse was being questioned about the problem of evil. The question was being posed to him, were the people that Pilate killed while making their sacrifices especially evil? This philosophical debate between Jesus and these listeners provides additional evidence of Pilate's hatred of the Jews and his outright disdain for their religious practices. You see, Pontius Pilate was a contradiction in many ways. He was strong, and he could be brutal, yet he also had some sense of justice and he was clearly uneasy with the thought of putting an innocent man to death. And we're going to see this much further as we move in a couple of weeks to the 6th stage of Jesus' trial. But for now, let's focus in another area. Let's look at the prosecutors, the Jewish priests, chief priests, and elders. Verses 12 through 13. But when he was accused by the chief priests and elders, he gave no answer. Then Pilate said to him, "Do you not hear how many things they testify against you?" Now, once again, we see Matthew's economy of words. We have been studying this Gospel of Matthew for a couple of years now, and we have seen how many times we will find that Matthew says this much, and Luke says this much, and John says this much. Matthew often uses words very sparingly. It seems to have been his style, his way of telling the story. Pilate clearly indicates that the chief priests and the elders, the rulers of the Sanhedrin, had not brought a few, but had brought many charges. But you see, Matthew's in a hurry. He's in a hurry to help us make the prophetic connection with Jesus' silence before his accusers. So he kind of rushes through and doesn't bother with the content of these charges. But by looking at all of the Gospels together, we can identify that there were 3 main charges, and Luke actually in his Gospel lays them out in a single verse. The first charge was sedition. This charge is found in Luke's account of the trial. In Luke 23, verse 2, the first few words we read, "And they began to accuse him, saying, 'We have found this man subverting our nation.'" Now these words, subverting the nation, were carefully chosen in order to inflame the concerns of a Roman judge. This is the charge of sedition. It is the charge that one was organizing a mob rebellion. And as an empire that had subjugated many formerly free people, the Romans were constantly dealing with seditious uprisings. It was something that they were scared about. They took it very seriously. It was a capital offense. And in suggesting that Jesus was actually putting a mob together, they're putting a cross before him. Now, the second charge is tax evasion. If there's any charge that'll bring a mobster down, right? Well, it's tax evasion. But look at the second part of Luke 23:2. He opposes payment of taxes to Caesar. Now, this is an odd charge, and it shows us that the chief priests and the elders actually had a weak case. There's something that I do that my wife does not do, so you can eat her pasta. But when I cook a bowl of pasta, being less experienced to cook than my wife, I have only learned one way to know when the pasta is done, because I like a little al dente, but not too much al dente. I take the piece of pasta and I throw it against the wall. And if it sticks, it's ready. And if it falls off the wall, it's not ready. That's how I know it's ready. That's exactly what the chief priests and the elders are doing. They're basically taking a handful of pasta, all of these false charges, they throw it all up against the wall to see if any of it will stick. Once again, they chose their words carefully, because the Roman Empire, well, let me back up for a second. Our cars run on what? Our trucks, gas or diesel. The Roman Empire ran on taxes. In fact, the tax burden was so great that some who have studied the collapse, the fall of the Roman Empire, say that one of the main reasons why Rome fell was because the people were being taxed to death. And they finally had their Popeye moment. That's all I can stands, I can't stands no more. And tax revolts spread up all over the empire, and it is one of the main reasons that Rome fell. Brief aside, I think that we could face a similar fate in America if Congress continues to spend money like drunken sailors on liberty. and funds their excesses with tax revenue, our money. Now, disclaimer, I had 2 sailors who came up to me after the Saturday night service, and they told me that they took personal offense. I could tell they were joking. They took personal offense with my characterization of drunken sailors on liberty. So then I looked at them both and I said, "So, did you ever do that?" And they took the fifth. We'll get to that in a little while. Of course, this was the most patently false of all the charges, because we saw earlier in our study of this gospel how Jesus was questioned, should we pay our taxes to Caesar? And you remember what Jesus did. It's one of his most brilliant moments. He says, take a coin out from your pocket. Whose image is on that coin? Caesar's. Then give to Caesar what belongs to Caesar, and render to God what belongs to God. Certainly Jesus was not guilty of tax evasion. He even created a miracle in order for his disciples to be able to pay the temple taxes. Now the third charge was treason. The final words in Luke 23:2 assert this charge, and saying that he himself is Messiah, a king. Those last words were intended to explain to the Roman reader, for example, the significance of the Messiah, a king. Now, this is clearly the charge that has most concerned Pilate, because treason was the ultimate high crime. We saw in verse 11 that this was where Pilate started his questioning of Jesus. Are you the king of the Jews? Now, our courtroom drama now introduces the last character, the defendant, Jesus of Nazareth. The 3 charges of concern to a Roman judge have been laid out: sedition, tax evasion, treason. They are serious charges, and Pontius Pilate expects an answer. However, in verse 14, we see that no answer is forthcoming. But he gave him no answer, not even to a single charge, so that the governor was greatly amazed. Now, before we directly dive into this verse, we must consider an important prophetic context, which is Matthew's greatest emphasis in his account of Jesus before Pilate. And we've already alluded to this very verse, Isaiah chapter 53, verse 7. He was oppressed and he was afflicted, yet he opened not his mouth. Like a lamb that is led to the slaughter, and like a sheep that before its shearers is silent, so he opened not his mouth. Matthew wants us to see that Jesus fulfilled this prophecy concerning the suffering servant of Yahweh. In fact, we've seen that this is one of the overall themes of the Gospel of Matthew, that Jesus fulfilled the Old Testament prophecies. But there is one key problem here. Jesus is not entirely silent. All 4 Gospels record Jesus answering Pilate's question as to whether he is a king or not with the words, "You have said so." And then John records a lengthy dialogue between Jesus and Pilate in John 18:33-38. So Pilate entered his headquarters again, and he called Jesus and he said to him, "Are you the king of the Jews?" Jesus answered, "Do you say this of your own accord, or did others say this about me?" Pilate answered, "Am I a Jew? Your own nation and the chief priests have delivered you over to me. What have you done?" Jesus answered, "My kingdom is not of this world. If my kingdom were of this world, my servants would have been fighting, that I might not be delivered over to the Jews. But my kingdom is not from the world." Then Pilate said to him, "So you are a king?" And Jesus answered, "You say that I am a king. For this purpose I was born, and for this purpose I have come into the world, to bear witness to the truth. Everyone who is of the truth listens to my voice." And Pilate said to him, "What is truth?" That question, brief aside, one of the burning questions of our day. This is where the debate of our culture is hinged right now. Are there absolute categories of truth? Or do we all just create our own truth? And I believe we see in the pages of the Bible crystal clearly that we do not create truth. We discern God's truth. But I just want you to see, as we look at this lengthy dialogue, these are not just a few words. Jesus unpacks the nature of his kingdom and his kingship. His kingdom at this time is a spiritual kingdom, although someday all of the levers of government will rest upon his shoulders. He is a king, and yet he is no threat to Caesar. So let's pose a prophetic question. Did Jesus truly not open his mouth? Did he truly fulfill Isaiah 53, verse 7? Or is Matthew fudging a bit? Let me share one key observation that will get Matthew very much off the hook. Jesus is not silent across the board. I don't believe that that is what Isaiah intended. It's certainly not what Matthew intended. Jesus is not silent across the board. He is silent before his accusers. He answers none of their charges, and he makes no personal defense. You see, Pilate is in the role of the judge, not the prosecutor. And Jesus respects his office, and he interacts with the governor and judge. But in all of the Gospels, it is absolutely certain that Jesus never speaks a word to these Jewish authorities. He refuses to answer them. He refuses to contribute to his defense. Returning to our text in verse 14, we see that Pontius Pilate was amazed. Think about how many trials Pilate must have seen. From historical sources, we learn that this is now the 7th year of Pontius Pilate's procuratorship. And in 7 years, he has been the highest legal authority. He has been the supreme court of the land. And think about how many witnesses he has heard from, how many defendants he has listened to. He has heard every conceivable excuse, every kind of case imaginable. And that tells me one thing. Pilate would not be easily amazed. I noticed that even as a chaplain working together with many of our first responders. These are not folks who get amazed about anything. Things that shock me, they're just not amazed because they've been around so long and they've seen so much. But Jesus shocked Pilate. Jesus amazed him. And that brings up a question. In what way did Jesus amaze Pilate? I think we can identify at least two things, two ways in which Jesus amazed him. And the first is this. In offering no defense under Roman law, Jesus must be declared guilty. Now, you see, our legal system is different because we have this neat little thing called the Fifth Amendment, right? I refuse to answer on the grounds that I might incriminate myself. And in that moment, you know two things. He's guilty, but also he's beyond in some way the reach of the law. This is a protection so that we cannot be compelled to speak if we would damage ourselves by answering a certain given question. We also have another little mechanism. It's called the insanity defense, where you could conceivably commit murder and yet avoid long-term incarceration. You might wind up in a psych hospital, but you might also, after a few years, be set free. And then we have all the lesser penalties, right? If you ever watch any crime shows, you see the plea bargaining that goes on, how they move from a capital offense to life in prison without no parole, to life but not life, and parole, and then out for good behavior after 12 years. I want you to understand something. Roman law had none of these things. None of these protections that we have grown so accustomed to. This past spring, my daughter Deanna, and I've told you part of this story, she parked her car where she had been told to park. She was not told that because she came an hour earlier that that same entrance was a parking lot and it was also a buses only lane. Now let me describe the trip very briefly. She drove about 10 miles per hour. She had no accident, no close call. And yet she lost her license for 3 months. And then she went to Spain, finally got it back a week ago. Now, I sat with Cindy in the courtroom, and we were doing two things, looking at Deanna and how she was taking all of this, but we were also staring at the judge, trying to read his face. And I could tell that the judge felt bad. She had a clean driving record, and others, I swear this to you, others committed far more serious infractions and walked out of court that day with their licenses in their pockets. But the judge's hands were tied. The Secretary of State had imposed a penalty that allowed for no exceptions. To use the more technical term, the judge had no judicial discretion. Under Roman law, Pontius Pilate had no judicial discretion either. If Jesus would not speak to his own defense, then he would, of necessity by Roman law, go to the cross. His silence, with life on the line, amazed Pilate. Nobody in their right mind did this. Of course you spoke in your defense. Nobody wants to go to a cross. And yet Jesus would not contribute to his defense. And this amazed Pilate. But I think there's a second thing that amazed Pilate. Despite this well-known fact, that not speaking in your defense would lead to a guilty verdict, despite this well-known fact, Jesus seemed calm and in command. Jesus did not seem like a lunatic. He did not seem like a man who didn't understand the charges before him, but he seemed calm. Next week, we will see that Pilate is not convinced that Jesus deserves death. Although he has no judicial discretion, over the next 2 weeks, we will see that he will try to find a way nonetheless to set Jesus free. Pilate doesn't understand the religion of the Jews. He actually cares nothing for them or for their God. However, he knows that the bloody and beaten man before him poses no threat to Rome. There's something peculiar in this man, something unsettling, something compelling, something downright noble, if not regal, in this prisoner who was calm and in command, despite the shadow of a cross now reaching towards him. So what do we do with this story of Jesus' trial? I'd like to share 3 important lessons, practical things that we can take home with us. And the first is this: Jesus shows us the power of a skillful response. We saw that in all 4 Gospels, Jesus answered Pilate's question as to whether or not he was a king with the words, "You have said so." Well, you see, under Roman law, that was the only good answer to give in that moment. Now, I want you to understand, Jesus was not being cagey. He fully intends to go to the cross, but he does model something very practical for all of us: the value of a skillful response. We tend to answer quickly. We shoot from our hip. I would put it this way: our mouths go in gear long before our brains, don't they? In a conflict situation, when we are most likely to shoot from the hip, let me encourage you to take some time. Shoot up a quick prayer. And if you're really hot, make it a long prayer rather than a knee-jerk reaction. A second practical lesson: there is wisdom in not responding to every criticism and accusation. Without getting overly political, I think that all of us, and it's very hard to make any kind of a political observation and bring the whole room together, but I think we would all agree that President Trump would be midway through his second term if he had applied this bit of wisdom. If somebody would have taken Twitter away from him, smashed his smartphone. But I watched Donald Trump my whole life growing up. He was on the news in New York City all the time. And from the time I was a small boy, I was watching this man in action. And anyone who knew Trump knew what to expect. He was a counterpuncher. He had to respond to every criticism. He had to return every blow with a harder blow. And in part, it became his undoing. And we'll see whether or not he's able to make a course correction and undo this. But Proverbs 15:18 speaks to all of us. A hot-tempered person stirs up conflict, but the one who is patient calms a quarrel. Jesus measured his words. He understood the power and the wisdom of silence. He's not calling us to be silent before every offense, but he does model for us that there is a time to speak, but also there is a time not to speak. You see, God is our defender. And when we insert ourselves in the process, we are a weak substitute. And then one final thing that we can take home with us. Acting beyond self-interest amazes people, especially those who don't know Jesus. You see, this may be one of the greatest evangelistic tools. And I took an entire class in seminary on evangelism with Dr. Robert Coleman. I took a second class in evangelism with Dr. John Nyquist. I've attended various evangelism seminars throughout the years, and no one has ever put their finger on this. You will not read it in a book, you will not hear it in a seminar, but I am convinced that this is one of our greatest evangelistic tools. Self-interested people are a dime a dozen, but selfless people are a precious gem, rare and beautiful. And there is something compelling, something downright amazing about somebody who is able to act beyond their own self-interest. Jesus teaches us this lesson from Pilate's court, and he teaches this lesson even more powerfully from the cross. If you want to lead your neighbor to Jesus, try some of these evangelistic steps. Try mowing their lawn. Try raking their leaves. Try not making a fuss when their neighbors commit the ultimate offense, and that is that they throw a party and their friends park in front of your house. Now, I've noticed that's not as big a deal in Geneseo. In New York City, I saw people have fist fights over that one. Imagine instead going up to those party guests and welcoming them and suggesting that you hope that they have a great time with their friends. You see, these kind of acts, simple, kind acts where we extend ourselves beyond our own selfish self-interest, amaze people. And they can provide you with an opportunity to introduce them to the man who amazed Pilate with his selfless integrity. Let's pray. Our Heavenly Father, Jesus is the answer. He just is. We look at every aspect of his life. We look at the way that he behaved when his life was on the line. And we see his grace and his royalty under extreme pressure. And in that moment, we see the wonder of his forgiveness, his willingness to go to the cross. A few words, and this case against him would have crumbled. It was illegal. It was false. It had no weight. He had a judge who was inclined to rule on his behalf, and nevertheless he refused to defend himself in order that he might go to the cross and gain for us redemption. Lord, I pray that you would help us to be like our Master, to be a forgiving and grace-filled people, and to amaze people with the gospel of Jesus. We pray in his name.